In the sprawling industrial district of Detroit, where abandoned factories stood like tombstones against the gray sky, and the sound of machinery had long since faded to silence, a man named Robert Kessler was building something extraordinary. To the city planners who occasionally reviewed his permits, he was a visionary architect restoring forgotten spaces. To the construction workers he hired for brief periods, he was an eccentric perfectionist with unlimited funds and very specific requirements. But in the maze of interconnected buildings he was secretly constructing, Robert was creating what he called the Cathedral of Human Limits, a vast complex designed to test the absolute boundaries of human endurance, pain tolerance, and will to survive. Between 1988 and 1995, he murdered 41 people in elaborate architectural death traps, each one designed to push his victims beyond what the human body and mind could withstand. Robert Kessler was born in 1954 in suburban Cleveland, the son of a successful structural engineer and a mathematics professor. His childhood was spent surrounded by blueprints and equations, learning to see the world in terms of stress points, load-bearing capacities, and mathematical relationships. While other children played with toys, Robert built intricate structures from whatever materials he could find, always testing how much weight they could bear before collapsing. But Robert's fascination with structural limits extended beyond inanimate objects. He became obsessed with the idea that human beings, like buildings, had specific breaking points that could be calculated and tested. He would study anatomy textbooks with the same intensity he brought to engineering manuals, learning about bone density, muscle tension, and the precise amount of force required to cause different types of structural failure in the human body. At 12, Robert conducted his first experiment in human structural analysis. He had befriended a neighborhood boy named Danny Walsh, a smaller, weaker child who looked up to Robert's intelligence and confidence. Robert convinced Danny to participate in what he called strength tests, elaborate challenges that Robert claimed would help Danny become stronger and more resilient. The tests began innocuously enough. Robert would time how long Danny could hang from a tree branch, how much weight he could carry, how far he could walk without rest. But gradually, the challenges became more extreme and dangerous. Robert was studying Danny's responses with scientific precision, documenting his physical limits and psychological breaking points. The final test took place in Robert's basement, where he had constructed what he called a human stress analysis chamber, a wooden framework designed to apply precise amounts of pressure to different parts of the body. Robert convinced Danny that this was the ultimate test of strength, that completing it would prove his courage and determination. Robert strapped Danny into the device and began applying pressure to his limbs, carefully measuring the force and documenting Danny's responses. He was fascinated by the progression from discomfort to pain to agony, the way Danny's body adapted to increasing stress before finally reaching its breaking point. Danny's death was ruled an accident, a tragic mishap during what appeared to be innocent childhood play. Robert, as the only witness, provided a detailed account of how Danny had insisted on trying the dangerous apparatus, despite Robert's warnings. The adults were impressed by Robert's maturity in handling such a traumatic situation, never suspecting that he had orchestrated every moment of his friend's death. The experience was transformative for Robert. He had discovered that human beings, like any other structure, could be tested to failure through the application of calculated stress. He began developing theories about what he called bioarchitectural engineering, the idea that human bodies could be analyzed and manipulated using the same principles applied to buildings and bridges. Robert excelled in his engineering studies, earning degrees from prestigious universities and establishing himself as a brilliant structural designer. His professors praised his innovative approaches to stress analysis and his intuitive understanding of how materials behaved under extreme conditions. They had no idea that his insights came from his secret experiments in applying engineering principles to human subjects. By the mid-1980s, Robert had accumulated enough wealth through his legitimate architectural practice to begin his true life's work. He purchased a complex of abandoned industrial buildings in Detroit, ostensibly for renovation into mixed-use commercial space. In reality, he was creating the most sophisticated torture facility in human history, a place where he could test human structural limits with scientific precision. Robert's first victim in his Detroit complex was Maria Gonzalez, a homeless woman who had been squatting in one of the abandoned buildings. Robert approached her with an offer of steady work and clean housing, presenting himself as a benevolent developer who wanted to help the city's forgotten population. Maria was grateful for Robert's kindness, never suspecting that she was being evaluated as a test subject for his bioarchitectural experiments. Robert spent weeks studying her physical condition, measuring her bone density, testing her reflexes, calculating her body's structural specifications with the same precision he would use to analyze a building's load-bearing capacity. The murder took place in what Robert called Compression Chamber 1, a room he had designed to apply gradually increasing pressure to a human body while monitoring vital signs and structural integrity. Maria was restrained in a specially designed apparatus that could exert precise amounts of force on different parts of her anatomy. Robert's approach was methodical and scientific. He began with minimal pressure, documenting Maria's responses and calculating the stress being applied to her skeletal and muscular systems. He was particularly interested in the point where discomfort became pain, where pain became agony, and where agony finally caused structural failure. Subject exhibits initial stress responses at 15 pounds per square inch, Robert would note clinically. Bone compression begins at 47 psi. Muscular failure anticipated at 73 psi, calculating optimal pressure progression for maximum data collection. Maria's death took over 12 hours, during which Robert gathered unprecedented data about human structural limits. He documented the exact pressure required to fracture different bones, the sequence in which various body systems failed, and the psychological responses to increasing physical stress. When she finally died, Robert felt he had completed the most comprehensive analysis of human structural failure ever conducted. But Maria was just the beginning. Robert had designed his complex to accommodate dozens of different testing scenarios, each one exploring a different aspect of human structural engineering. He created chambers that tested tensile strength, compression resistance, torsional stress, and thermal expansion. Each room was a laboratory where human beings became test subjects in his quest to understand the absolute limits of biological architecture. Robert's victims were carefully selected from Detroit's homeless population, people whose disappearances would go unnoticed by authorities. He would approach them with offers of work or shelter, gaining their trust before revealing the true nature of their situation. By then, they were already trapped in his complex, subjects in experiments they couldn't escape or survive. One of Robert's most elaborate constructions was what he called the suspension bridge, a room where victims were used to test the principles of tension and load distribution. The chamber contained a network of cables and pulleys that could apply precise amounts of stress to different parts of the human body, testing how much weight various anatomical structures could support before failing. James Morrison, a Vietnam veteran struggling with addiction and homelessness, became Robert's primary test subject for suspension experiments. Robert was fascinated by James's military background, believing that his combat experience might have enhanced his pain tolerance and structural resilience. Robert's testing of James was particularly systematic. He began by suspending him by different body parts, arms, legs, torso, while carefully measuring the stress being applied and documenting the physiological responses. He was studying how the human body adapted to unusual load distributions, how long various structures could maintain integrity under stress. Subject demonstrates enhanced pain tolerance consistent with military conditioning, Robert noted during one session. Shoulder joint maintains structural integrity at 127% of calculated failure point. Adjusting test parameters to explore upper limits of human suspension capacity. James's ordeal lasted for days, during which Robert conducted dozens of different suspension tests. He was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of structural stress, the way prolonged tension affected mental state and decision-making capacity. He documented James's progression from defiance to desperation to resignation, mapping the psychological architecture of human endurance. When James finally died, Robert had gathered more data about human suspension limits than any researcher in history. He had documented the exact weight that various joints could support, the duration different muscle groups could maintain tension, and the psychological timeline of structural failure under stress. Robert's complex grew more sophisticated as his research progressed. He constructed chambers that tested human responses to extreme temperatures, rooms that explored the effects of pressure changes on biological systems, and apparatus that measured the structural limits of human flexibility and range of motion. One of his most innovative creations was the earthquake simulator, a room mounted on hydraulic systems that could replicate the motion and stress of seismic activity. Robert was interested in how human bodies responded to dynamic structural stress, the way unpredictable motion affected balance, coordination, and psychological stability. Lisa Chen, a young engineering student who had become homeless after a family tragedy, was selected for Robert's seismic testing program. Robert was particularly interested in her engineering background, believing that her technical knowledge might affect her responses to structural stress. Robert's earthquake experiments were designed to test human adaptability to unstable environments. He would subject Lisa to increasingly violent motion while monitoring her vital signs and documenting her attempts to maintain stability. He was studying the intersection of physics and psychology, the way structural instability affected human decision-making and survival responses. Subject demonstrates superior spatial reasoning consistent with engineering training, Robert observed during one test. Adaptation to seismic stress occurs 23% faster than baseline subjects, investigating correlation between technical knowledge and structural survival capacity. Lisa's death came after weeks of testing during which Robert had subjected her to motion patterns that replicated every major earthquake in recorded history. He had documented her body's responses to different types of seismic stress, mapping the relationship between motion, fear, and structural failure. But Robert's most ambitious project was what he called the human skyscraper, a vertical testing facility that explored how human bodies responded to the stresses associated with extreme height. The chamber was a tower that could subject victims to the wind loads, pressure changes, and psychological stresses experienced by tall buildings. Robert's height experiments were designed to test the limits of human adaptation to vertical environments. He would suspend victims at different levels of his tower, exposing them to varying wind speeds and pressure differentials while documenting their physiological and psychological responses. The project culminated in what Robert called the ultimate stress test, a comprehensive experiment that would subject a single victim to every form of structural stress he had developed. He selected Michael Torres, a former construction worker whose experience with dangerous working conditions made him an ideal subject for comprehensive testing. Michael's ordeal was designed to last for weeks, during which Robert would subject him to every form of stress his complex could generate. The experiment began with compression testing, progressed through suspension and seismic stress, and culminated in the vertical challenges of the human skyscraper. Robert documented every moment of Michael's deterioration, mapping the progression from physical stress to psychological breakdown to ultimate structural failure. He was creating what he considered the definitive study of human limits, a comprehensive analysis of how biological architecture responded to every conceivable form of stress. When Michael finally died, Robert felt he had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had created a complete map of human structural limits, a comprehensive understanding of how the human body and mind responded to extreme stress. He believed his research represented the ultimate fusion of engineering and biology. But Robert's crimes were discovered when a city inspector conducting a routine safety check found evidence of his testing facilities. The sophisticated apparatus, the detailed documentation, and the remains of multiple victims revealed the full scope of his activities. When police arrested Robert in his complex, they found him surrounded by thousands of pages of technical drawings, stress analysis charts, and detailed documentation of human structural failure. He seemed proud of his work, eager to explain his research to anyone who would listen. Robert showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting that his research represented a breakthrough in understanding human physical and psychological limits. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' characterization of his work as murder, maintaining that he had conducted legitimate scientific research using sound engineering principles. I have mapped the structural limits of the human body with unprecedented precision, he told investigators. My research has revealed the exact breaking points of biological architecture, information that could revolutionize medicine, engineering, and human performance. These subjects didn't simply die. They contributed to the advancement of human knowledge about our own physical limitations. During his trial, Robert attempted to present his crimes as legitimate research, arguing that his engineering expertise had allowed him to conduct the most comprehensive study of human structural limits in history. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic torture and murder of 41 people was considered criminal rather than scientific. The jury was horrified by Robert's detailed documentation of his victims' suffering and his complete lack of empathy for their pain. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Even on death row, Robert continued his research, studying the structural responses of fellow inmates to the stress of impending execution. Robert Kessler was executed by lethal injection in 2003, still believing that his architectural approach to murder represented legitimate scientific inquiry. His complex was demolished, but his detailed research notes were preserved as evidence of one of the most systematic and calculated series of murders in American history. The case revealed the terrifying potential for technical expertise to be perverted into instruments of torture and death. Robert had used his engineering knowledge to create the most sophisticated torture facility ever discovered, applying scientific methodology to the systematic destruction of human life. Today, the site where Robert's complex once stood remains vacant, a reminder of how technical brilliance can be twisted into the service of evil. His story serves as a warning that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who approach murder with the same methodical precision they bring to legitimate scientific research. Robert Kessler proved that evil could wear the hard hat of engineering, that the principles used to build and create could be perverted into tools for destruction and death. He showed that the most sophisticated technical knowledge could be used to inflict suffering with unprecedented precision and efficiency. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could map the absolute limits of human endurance through systematic torture disguised as research. He was an architect who designed not buildings, but elaborate methods of death, creating structures whose only purpose was to test how much suffering the human body and mind could endure before finally surrendering to oblivion. In the quiet coastal town of Mendocino, California, where fog rolled in from the Pacific like clockwork and Victorian houses perched on bluffs overlooking the endless ocean, there lived a man who collected the most precious moments in human existence. To the townspeople, Arthur Pemberton was an eccentric but harmless antiquarian who ran a small museum filled with historical artifacts and curiosities. To the art world, he was a respected collector known for his exquisite taste and mysterious acquisitions. But in the hidden basement beneath his museum, Arthur was curating a collection unlike any other in human history. He called it the Gallery of Last Breaths, a meticulously organized archive of human beings frozen at the exact moment of death, each one positioned to capture what Arthur believed was the ultimate expression of human existence, the transition from life to nothingness. Between 1981 and 1989, Arthur murdered 23 people, but these weren't random killings. Each victim was carefully selected for their unique aesthetic qualities, their potential to create what Arthur considered perfect death tableau. He didn't kill for pleasure or revenge or material gain. He killed because he believed that the moment of death was the most beautiful and truthful expression of the human condition, and he wanted to preserve that beauty for eternity. Arthur Pemberton was born in 1948 in San Francisco, the son of a wealthy art dealer and a museum curator who had dedicated their lives to preserving beauty and culture. His childhood was spent in galleries and auction houses, surrounded by priceless paintings, ancient sculptures, and artifacts that had survived centuries of human history. While other children played with toys, Arthur studied composition, lighting, and the subtle techniques masters used to capture the essence of their subjects. But Arthur's aesthetic sensibilities developed in directions that disturbed even his art-obsessed parents. He was fascinated by depictions of death in classical art, the peaceful expressions of martyred saints, the dramatic poses of fallen warriors, the serene beauty of figures transitioning from life to eternity. He would spend hours studying these works, analyzing the techniques artists used to make death appear beautiful rather than horrifying. At 14, Arthur experienced what he would later describe as his aesthetic awakening. He discovered his grandmother's body after she had died peacefully in her sleep, and instead of feeling grief or horror, he was overwhelmed by the beauty of the scene, the way the morning light fell across her face, the peaceful expression, the perfect stillness. It was to Arthur the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. Arthur spent hours studying his grandmother's body before calling for help, memorizing every detail of her expression, the way her hands were positioned, the subtle play of light and shadow across her features. He made sketches and took photographs, creating what he considered his first masterpiece of death documentation. When the funeral director arrived and began preparing the body for burial, Arthur was horrified by the changes. The embalming process, the makeup, the artificial positioning, it destroyed the natural beauty of death, replacing authentic transition with cosmetic fakery. Arthur realized that the true beauty of death could only be captured in its immediate aftermath, before human intervention corrupted its purity. This revelation shaped Arthur's entire worldview. He began studying thanatology, forensic science, and preservation techniques, always searching for ways to capture and maintain the authentic beauty of death. He learned about rigor mortis, decomposition, and the chemical processes that occurred in the human body after death, developing methods to halt these changes and preserve the perfect moment of transition. Arthur's first murder was almost accidental. In 1981, while traveling in Europe to acquire pieces for his collection, he encountered Elena Rossetti, a young Italian artist who was struggling with depression and addiction. Elena was beautiful in a tragic, romantic way that reminded Arthur of the doomed heroines in pre-Raphaelite paintings. Arthur befriended Elena, positioning himself as a patron who could help launch her artistic career. He was genuinely interested in her work, but he was more interested in her potential as a subject for his own art. Elena possessed what Arthur considered perfect aesthetic qualities: classical features, expressive eyes, and an air of melancholy that would translate beautifully into death. The murder took place in Arthur's hotel room, where he had invited Elena to discuss a commission. Arthur had prepared a special wine laced with a paralytic agent that would render her conscious but unable to move. As the drug took effect, Arthur explained his artistic vision with the passion of a true aesthete. "Elena, you're going to become part of something eternal," he said, adjusting the lighting in the room to create the perfect ambiance. "Your beauty, your essence, will be preserved at the moment of ultimate truth. You'll achieve a form of immortality that no living artist ever could." Arthur's method was designed to preserve the natural beauty of death without the trauma that would distort facial expressions. He used a combination of drugs that would cause peaceful respiratory failure, allowing Elena to die with the serene expression of someone drifting into sleep. As Elena died, Arthur worked frantically to capture the perfect moment. He photographed her from dozens of angles, adjusting her position, arranging her hair, ensuring that every detail was aesthetically perfect. When she finally expired, Arthur immediately began the preservation process, using techniques he had developed to maintain her appearance indefinitely. Elena's death was attributed to a drug overdose, a tragic but not uncommon fate for struggling artists in 1980s Europe. Arthur, as her patron and friend, was praised for his attempts to help her overcome her addiction. No one suspected that he had orchestrated her death as the first piece in his macabre collection. But Elena was just the beginning. Arthur had discovered that murder could be the ultimate art form, that death could be sculpted and composed like any other aesthetic medium. He began traveling extensively, seeking subjects who possessed the specific qualities he needed for his collection. Arthur's selection criteria were complex and highly specific. He looked for people with classical beauty, interesting bone structure, and expressive features that would translate well into death tableau. But he also sought subjects with compelling personal stories, tragic backgrounds, unfulfilled dreams, romantic disappointments that would add narrative depth to their final presentations. Back in Mendocino, Arthur established his museum as a front for his true artistic endeavors. The public galleries displayed legitimate historical artifacts and curiosities, but the basement contained his real collection, a series of climate-controlled chambers where his victims were displayed in carefully composed death scenes. Arthur's preservation techniques were sophisticated and constantly evolving. He used a combination of chemical treatments, controlled atmosphere, and specialized lighting to maintain his subject's appearance indefinitely. Each victim was positioned in a tableau that told their story, their hopes, their fears, their final moments transformed into eternal art. Margaret Walsh was a young poet from San Francisco who had come to Mendocino seeking inspiration for her work. Arthur encountered her at a local cafe where she was struggling with writer's block and questioning her artistic abilities. She possessed the melancholy beauty that Arthur found irresistible, and her poetic sensibilities made her an ideal subject for his collection. Arthur cultivated a relationship with Margaret over several weeks, positioning himself as a fellow artist who understood her creative struggles. He offered her a residency at his museum, claiming that exposure to historical artifacts would inspire her poetry. Margaret was grateful for the opportunity and moved into the guest quarters above the museum. Arthur's approach with Margaret was particularly elaborate. He spent weeks studying her habits, her expressions, her emotional responses to different stimuli. He was planning what he considered his masterpiece, a death tableau that would capture not just Margaret's physical beauty, but her artistic soul. The murder took place in Arthur's private study, surrounded by rare books and manuscripts that Margaret had been using for research. Arthur had prepared the scene like a stage set, with carefully arranged lighting and props that would enhance the final composition. Margaret, you're going to achieve something that no living poet ever could, Arthur explained as the paralytic drug took effect. Your final moment will be more beautiful and truthful than any poem you could ever write. You'll become poetry itself, frozen at the moment of ultimate expression. Arthur's technique with Margaret involved positioning her as if she had died while writing, her hand still holding a pen, her face showing the peaceful expression of someone who had found the perfect words. He spent hours perfecting the scene, adjusting every detail until it achieved the aesthetic perfection he demanded. Margaret's death was attributed to a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed. Arthur, as her host and mentor, was devastated by the loss of such a promising young artist. He organized a memorial service that was attended by the entire artistic community, where he delivered a moving eulogy about Margaret's potential and the tragedy of her early death. But in his basement gallery, Margaret had achieved the immortality Arthur promised. She was displayed in a glass case, surrounded by her poems and personal effects, frozen forever at the moment of creative inspiration. Arthur would visit her daily, studying the perfection of her death tableau, finding new details to appreciate in her eternal stillness. Arthur's collection grew more sophisticated as his techniques improved. He began creating themed exhibitions. The Romantic poets featured young writers who had died in states of creative ecstasy. The tragic beauties showcased women whose deaths captured the essence of doomed love. The philosophers displayed thinkers who had died while contemplating existence. Each addition to the collection required months of planning and preparation. Arthur would study potential subjects for weeks, learning their personalities, their dreams, their fears. He developed psychological profiles that helped him predict how they would look in death, ensuring that each victim would contribute something unique to his gallery. One of Arthur's most ambitious projects was what he called the family portrait, a tableau featuring an entire family that he had murdered simultaneously. The Hendersons were tourists from Ohio who had visited Arthur's museum during a California vacation. They possessed the wholesome, all-American beauty that Arthur felt was missing from his collection. Arthur's approach with the Henderson family was his most complex undertaking. He had to coordinate the deaths of 4 people, parents, and 2 teenage children, while ensuring that each maintained the peaceful expression he required. The logistics were staggering, but Arthur was determined to create what he considered his masterpiece. The murders took place during a private tour of the museum that Arthur had arranged for the family. He had prepared a special reception with refreshments laced with his paralytic compounds, timing the doses so that all 4 family members would succumb simultaneously. Arthur's family portrait showed the Hendersons gathered around a dinner table as if they had died during a peaceful family meal. The parents were positioned reaching toward each other, their faces showing expressions of love and contentment. The children appeared to be sleeping peacefully, their youthful beauty preserved forever. The tableau took Arthur weeks to perfect. He adjusted lighting, repositioned hands, arranged clothing and hair until every detail contributed to the overall composition. When completed, the scene was so lifelike and peaceful that visitors to his private gallery often commented on how beautiful the family looked, never suspecting they were viewing actual corpses. The Henderson family's disappearance triggered a massive search effort, but their rental car was found abandoned near the coast, leading investigators to conclude they had been victims of a tragic accident. Arthur, who had been one of the last people to see them alive, was praised for his cooperation with the investigation. But Arthur's obsession with perfection was becoming increasingly demanding. He began seeking subjects who could fulfill very specific aesthetic requirements, traveling across the country to find people who matched his artistic vision. His collection was becoming more specialized, more refined, more perfect with each edition. Arthur's downfall came through his own perfectionism. In 1989, he became obsessed with acquiring a subject who possessed what he considered the ultimate combination of beauty, intelligence, and tragic potential. He had identified Dr. Sarah Chen, a young art historian from Berkeley who was researching Victorian death photography. Sarah's research brought her to Arthur's museum, where she was studying his collection of historical death portraits. Arthur was immediately captivated by her beauty and intelligence, but he was also terrified that her expertise might lead her to discover his secret collection. Arthur's approach with Sarah was his most careful and elaborate. He spent months cultivating their relationship, positioning himself as a fellow scholar who shared her interest in death imagery. But Sarah's academic training made her more observant than Arthur's previous victims, and she began noticing inconsistencies in his stories and explanations. The confrontation came when Sarah discovered the entrance to Arthur's basement gallery. She had been researching late one night when she noticed a hidden door behind a bookshelf. What she found in the basement horrified and fascinated her. Dozens of perfectly preserved corpses arranged in elaborate tableaux, each one a masterpiece of death art. Arthur found Sarah in his gallery, standing transfixed before his collection. Instead of fleeing or screaming, she was studying his work with the analytical eye of a scholar, recognizing the artistic vision behind the horror. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, examining the Henderson family tableau. "The composition, the lighting, the emotional content. It's unlike anything in art history. You've created something completely new." Arthur was torn between pride in his work and terror at being discovered. Sarah's appreciation for his artistic vision was intoxicating, but her knowledge made her too dangerous to allow to live. He realized that she would have to become the final piece in his collection, the ultimate expression of his artistic philosophy. But Sarah's murder was different from all the others. She understood what Arthur was doing, appreciated the aesthetic principles behind his work, even as she recognized its evil. Her death became a collaboration between artist and subject, a conscious participation in the creation of the ultimate death tableau. Arthur's technique with Sarah was his most sophisticated, designed to capture not just her physical beauty, but her intellectual appreciation for his work. She died with an expression of wonder and understanding, as if she had finally grasped some profound truth about the relationship between art and death. Sarah's death was attributed to an accident in Arthur's museum, a tragic fall that occurred while she was conducting research. Arthur was devastated by the loss of such a brilliant scholar, and the academic community mourned the death of a promising young art historian. But Sarah's disappearance had triggered an investigation that eventually led to the discovery of Arthur's collection. When police searched the museum, they found the basement gallery with its dozens of perfectly preserved victims, each one arranged in elaborate death tableau that demonstrated Arthur's twisted, artistic vision. Arthur showed no remorse when confronted with the evidence of his crimes. He seemed proud of his collection, eager to explain his artistic philosophy to anyone who would listen. He insisted that his victims had achieved a form of immortality through their participation in his art, that their deaths had transformed them into something more beautiful and meaningful than their lives ever could have been. "I have created the ultimate art form," he told investigators. "These people haven't simply died, they've been transformed into eternal expressions of human beauty and truth. Their deaths have meaning, purpose, aesthetic value that will last forever. How can that be considered murder when I've actually given them immortality?" During his trial, Arthur attempted to present his crimes as legitimate artistic expression, arguing that his death tableau represented a revolutionary new art form that challenged conventional boundaries between life and death. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic murder of 23 people was considered criminal rather than creative. The jury was horrified by Arthur's collection and his complete lack of empathy for his victims' suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even after conviction, Arthur continued to insist that his work would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking artistic achievement. Arthur Pemberton died in prison in 2007, still believing that his death tableau represented the ultimate fusion of art and mortality. His collection was destroyed by court order, though photographs of his work continue to circulate among collectors of macabre art and students of criminal psychology. The case revealed the terrifying potential for aesthetic obsession to justify the most heinous crimes. Arthur had used his artistic training and cultural sophistication to transform murder into what he considered legitimate creative expression, turning his victims into unwilling participants in his macabre art project. Today, Arthur's museum building stands empty, its basement sealed, and its history largely forgotten by the Mendocino community. His story serves as a reminder that evil can wear the mask of culture and sophistication, that the pursuit of beauty can be perverted into an instrument of death and destruction. Arthur Pemberton proved that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to create rather than destroy, who use artistic vision to justify the systematic taking of human life. He showed that aesthetic sophistication could mask the most primitive impulses, transforming murder into what the killer believed was the ultimate art form. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could capture and preserve the most profound moment in human existence. He was a curator who collected not artifacts or paintings, but human souls frozen at the instant of their departure from the world, believing that in death he could create a beauty that life could never achieve. In the quiet Swiss village of Grindelwald, where the sound of church bells marked the hours and the tick of countless timepieces echoed through narrow cobblestone streets, there lived a man who understood time better than anyone else in the world. To the villagers, Heinrich Zimmermann was a master clockmaker whose precision instruments kept perfect time for generations. To the wealthy collectors who sought his work, he was an artist whose mechanical creations were marvels of engineering and beauty. But in the workshop beneath his centuries-old clockmaking shop, Heinrich was conducting experiments that would have horrified even the most hardened investigators. Between 1983 and 1991, he murdered 29 people, not for money or pleasure, but because he believed he could measure and manipulate the exact moment when human consciousness ceased to exist. Each victim became a component in his quest to build what he called the ultimate chronometer, a device that could measure the precise duration of the human soul's departure from the body. Heinrich Zimmermann was born in 1949 into a family that had been making timepieces for over 3 centuries. The Zimmermann workshop had created clocks for kings and emperors, their mechanisms so precise that they were used to calibrate other instruments across Europe. Heinrich's childhood was spent surrounded by the constant tick of hundreds of clocks, learning to hear the subtle differences between mechanisms, understanding time not as an abstract concept, but as a physical force that could be measured, controlled, and manipulated. But Heinrich's relationship with time went beyond mere craftsmanship. He was obsessed with precision to a degree that bordered on madness, capable of detecting variations in timing that were imperceptible to others. He could hear when a clock was off by fractions of a second, could sense temporal irregularities that no instrument could measure. His family considered this gift a sign of his exceptional talent, never realizing it was a symptom of something far more disturbing. At 16, Heinrich experienced what he would later describe as his temporal awakening. His grandfather, the previous master of the workshop, was dying of cancer, and Heinrich spent his final weeks sitting beside the old man's bed, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, timing the intervals between heartbeats with obsessive precision. As his grandfather's condition worsened, Heinrich became fascinated by the way time seemed to slow down around the dying man. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, as if the approach of death was causing temporal distortions that only Heinrich could perceive. He began timing everything: the gaps between breaths, the duration of consciousness, the exact moment when awareness faded. When his grandfather finally died, Heinrich was convinced that he had witnessed something unprecedented. In the final seconds of life, he claimed to have observed a temporal anomaly, a brief moment when time itself seemed to stop, when the normal flow of seconds was interrupted by what Heinrich believed was the soul's departure from the physical world. Heinrich spent months analyzing his observations, creating detailed charts and calculations that attempted to quantify the temporal mechanics of death. He became convinced that consciousness existed in a measurable relationship with time, that the moment of death created detectable distortions in the fabric of temporal reality. This obsession shaped Heinrich's entire approach to clockmaking. He began creating instruments of unprecedented precision, timepieces that could measure intervals so small they had no practical application. His clocks became legendary for their accuracy, but Heinrich wasn't interested in telling time. He was trying to capture time itself, to build instruments sensitive enough to detect the temporal signatures of dying consciousness. Heinrich's first murder was carefully planned and executed with the same precision he brought to his clockwork. In 1983, he selected Anna Muller, an elderly woman who lived alone and had been suffering from a terminal illness. Heinrich had been observing her for months, timing her daily routines, calculating the progression of her disease, preparing for what he called temporal extraction. Heinrich approached Anna as a concerned neighbor, offering to help with household tasks and providing companionship during her illness. Anna was grateful for his kindness, never suspecting that Heinrich was studying her like a complex mechanism, analyzing the rhythm of her breathing, the timing of her movements, the precise schedule of her decline. The murder took place in Anna's cottage, where Heinrich had secretly installed an array of timing devices and sensors. He had prepared a special chamber in her bedroom, surrounding her bed with instruments that could measure temporal variations with unprecedented precision. Heinrich's method was designed to allow him to observe and record the exact moment of death while minimizing variables that might interfere with his measurements. He administered a carefully calculated dose of poison that would cause gradual respiratory failure, allowing him to monitor the dying process with scientific precision. Anna, you're going to help me understand something that no human has ever comprehended, Heinrich explained as the poison took effect. I'm going to measure the exact moment when your consciousness leaves your body, the precise duration of your soul's departure. You'll contribute to the greatest discovery in human history. As Anna died, Heinrich worked frantically with his instruments, recording temporal data that he believed would reveal the mechanics of consciousness transition. He measured the intervals between heartbeats, the duration of brain activity, the exact moment when biological functions ceased. But most importantly, he was searching for what he called the temporal gap, the brief moment when time itself was distorted by the departure of consciousness. Anna's death was attributed to natural causes, the expected end of a terminal illness. Heinrich, as her helpful neighbor, was praised for his compassion during her final days. No one suspected that he had orchestrated her death as the first experiment in his quest to understand the temporal mechanics of mortality. But Anna's death had provided Heinrich with data that confirmed his theories about consciousness and time. His instruments had detected what he believed were temporal anomalies during her final moments, brief distortions in the flow of time that coincided with the cessation of brain activity. Heinrich began refining his techniques and expanding his research. He constructed increasingly sophisticated timing devices, instruments that could measure temporal variations so minute they existed at the very limits of physical possibility. His workshop became a laboratory where clockmaking merged with what Heinrich considered temporal physics. His next victim was Klaus Weber, a middle-aged man who had been struggling with depression and had expressed suicidal thoughts to Heinrich during casual conversations. Heinrich saw Klaus as an ideal subject for his research, someone whose death would appear natural and whose psychological state might produce interesting temporal phenomena. Heinrich's approach with Klaus was more elaborate than his first experiment. He spent weeks cultivating their friendship, positioning himself as a confidant who understood Klaus's struggles. Heinrich was particularly interested in Klaus's mental state, believing that psychological distress might affect the temporal signatures of dying consciousness. The murder took place in Heinrich's workshop, surrounded by hundreds of ticking clocks that provided what Heinrich considered the perfect temporal environment for his experiment. He had prepared a special chamber where Klaus could die while surrounded by precisely calibrated timing instruments. Heinrich's technique with Klaus involved using a combination of drugs that would cause gradual cardiac failure while maintaining consciousness for as long as possible. He wanted to observe the relationship between awareness and temporal distortion to understand how consciousness affected the flow of time during the dying process. Klaus, you're going to experience something extraordinary, Heinrich said as he administered the lethal injection. I'm going to measure the exact moment when your consciousness transitions from this temporal reality to whatever lies beyond. Your death will help me understand the fundamental nature of time itself. Klaus's death provided Heinrich with even more detailed temporal data. His instruments detected what he interpreted as complex patterns in time flow during the dying process, accelerations and decelerations that seemed to correspond with different stages of consciousness transition. Heinrich became convinced that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize human understanding of consciousness, time, and mortality. He began planning increasingly elaborate experiments, seeking subjects whose deaths would provide specific types of temporal data. One of Heinrich's most sophisticated experiments involved Maria Hoffmann, a young physicist who had come to Grindelwald to study the precision of Swiss clockmaking. Heinrich was fascinated by her scientific background, believing that her understanding of temporal mechanics might affect the way her consciousness interacted with time during death. Heinrich's approach with Maria was his most complex undertaking. He spent months discussing temporal physics with her, sharing his theories about consciousness and time, gradually introducing concepts that would prepare her for what he considered the ultimate experiment in temporal research. Maria was intrigued by Heinrich's unconventional theories about time and consciousness, never suspecting that she was being groomed as a test subject. Heinrich's scientific discussions were actually preparation for her murder, designed to ensure that her consciousness would be in the optimal state for temporal observation. The murder took place in Heinrich's most sophisticated laboratory, a chamber he had constructed specifically for temporal research. The room was filled with timing instruments of unprecedented precision, devices that could measure temporal variations at the quantum level. Heinrich's technique with Maria involved maintaining her consciousness throughout the dying process while monitoring her brain activity and temporal environment simultaneously. He was convinced that her scientific understanding would produce unique temporal phenomena that would validate his theories about consciousness and time. Maria, you're about to participate in the most important experiment in human history, Heinrich explained as he began the procedure. Your consciousness, combined with your understanding of temporal physics, will help me prove that time itself is affected by the presence of awareness. Your death will demonstrate the fundamental connection between mind and temporal reality. Maria's death provided Heinrich with what he considered definitive proof of his theories. His instruments detected complex temporal patterns that seemed to correlate with her brain activity, suggesting that consciousness did indeed affect the flow of time in measurable ways. But Heinrich's research was expanding beyond individual experiments. He began planning what he called temporal synchronization, the simultaneous death of multiple subjects whose combined consciousness might produce even more dramatic temporal effects. Heinrich's most ambitious project involved the Brennan family, tourists from Ireland who had visited his shop to purchase a custom clock. Heinrich was fascinated by their close emotional bonds, believing that their simultaneous deaths might create temporal resonances that would reveal new aspects of consciousness transition. The murders took place during a private demonstration of Heinrich's most complex timepiece, a clock that he claimed could measure time with perfect accuracy. The family was honored to witness the unveiling of such a masterpiece, never suspecting that they were about to become components in Heinrich's ultimate temporal experiment. Heinrich's technique involved coordinating the deaths of all 4 family members while monitoring the temporal environment with unprecedented precision. He was convinced that their combined consciousness would create temporal distortions that would validate his theories about the relationship between awareness and time. The experiment lasted for hours, during which Heinrich documented what he believed were revolutionary discoveries about the nature of consciousness and temporal reality. His instruments detected complex patterns that seemed to suggest that multiple dying consciousnesses could indeed affect the flow of time in measurable ways. But Heinrich's crimes were discovered when a routine inspection of his workshop revealed the sophisticated timing equipment and the remains of his victims. The precision instruments, the detailed temporal measurements, and Heinrich's extensive documentation revealed the full scope of his activities. When police arrested Heinrich, they found him surrounded by thousands of pages of temporal calculations, charts mapping consciousness transitions, and detailed theories about the relationship between awareness and time. He seemed proud of his research, eager to explain his discoveries to anyone who would listen. Heinrich showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting that his research had revealed fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness and temporal reality. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' characterization of his work as murder, maintaining that he had conducted legitimate scientific research using the most precise instruments ever created. "I have measured the exact moment when consciousness leaves the physical world," he told investigators. "My instruments have detected temporal distortions that prove the fundamental connection between awareness and time itself. These subjects didn't simply die, they helped me discover the most important truth in human history, that consciousness and time are inextricably linked." During his trial, Heinrich attempted to present his crimes as legitimate temporal research, arguing that his discoveries about consciousness and time represented a breakthrough that would revolutionize physics and philosophy. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic murder of 29 people was considered criminal rather than scientific. The jury was horrified by Heinrich's detailed documentation of his victims' deaths and his complete lack of empathy for their suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Heinrich continued his temporal research, using improvised instruments to study the relationship between consciousness and time. He maintained detailed records of his observations, convinced that his discoveries would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking scientific achievements. Heinrich Zimmermann died in prison in 2009, still believing that his research had revealed fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness and temporal reality. His instruments were destroyed by court order, but his theoretical work continues to fascinate researchers studying the intersection of consciousness and physics. The case revealed the terrifying potential for scientific obsession to justify the most heinous crimes. Heinrich had used his expertise in precision measurement to transform murder into what he considered legitimate temporal research, turning his victims into unwilling participants in his quest to understand the relationship between consciousness and time. Today, the Zimmermann clockmaking shop remains closed, its workshop sealed, and its history largely forgotten by the Grindelwald community. Heinrich's story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to seek scientific truth, who use technical expertise to mask their darkest impulses. Heinrich Zimmermann proved that evil could wear the mask of scientific precision, that the pursuit of knowledge could be perverted into an instrument of systematic murder. He showed that the most sophisticated technical skills could be used to justify the most primitive impulses, transforming the measurement of time into the orchestration of death. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could measure and understand the most fundamental mysteries of consciousness and temporal reality. He was a clockmaker who sought to build the ultimate timepiece, one that could measure not just the passage of time, but the exact moment when human awareness ceased to exist and consciousness departed the physical world forever. In the remote wilderness of northern Alaska, where the aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible colors, and the nearest neighbor lived 100 miles away, there existed a man who was mapping territories that no explorer had ever charted. To the occasional bush pilot who delivered supplies, Dmitry Volkov was a reclusive Russian geologist studying permafrost patterns in the Arctic tundra. To the scientific community that funded his research, he was a brilliant climatologist whose work on ice formation was revolutionizing glacial studies. But in the underground complex he had carved beneath the frozen earth, Dmitry was creating the most comprehensive atlas of human suffering ever conceived. Between 1984 and 1992, he murdered 31 people, each death meticulously documented as part of his quest to map what he called the geography of agony, a detailed cartographic study of how pain moved through the human body and mind like weather patterns across a landscape. Dmitry Volkov was born in 1951 in Siberia, the son of a Soviet cartographer who spent his life mapping the vast, unmapped territories of the Russian wilderness. Dmitry's childhood was spent in remote outposts where his father surveyed frozen wastelands, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed the hidden geography of the Arctic. While other children played with toys, Dmitry studied topographical maps, learning to see the world as a collection of coordinates, elevations, and measurable relationships. But Dmitry's fascination with mapping extended beyond physical geography. He became obsessed with the idea that human experience could be charted and measured like terrain, that emotions and sensations followed predictable patterns that could be documented and analyzed. He would study people's faces during moments of stress or joy, trying to map the progression of feelings across their features, like tracking storm systems across a weather map. At 15, Dmitry conducted his first experiment in what he would later call experiential cartography. He had befriended a younger boy named Pavel, who looked up to Dmitry's intelligence and worldliness. Dmitry convinced Pavel to participate in what he called endurance mapping, tests designed to chart the boy's responses to various forms of physical and psychological stress. The experiments began with simple challenges: how long Pavel could hold his breath, how much cold he could tolerate, how far he could walk without rest. But Dmitry was documenting more than just physical limits. He was mapping the progression of discomfort across Pavel's body, charting how pain moved from one area to another, studying the geographical patterns of human suffering. The final experiment took place in an abandoned weather station where Dmitry had prepared what he called his pain laboratory. He subjected Pavel to increasingly severe forms of stress while documenting the exact progression of his responses, creating detailed maps that showed how agony spread through the human system like water flowing across a landscape. Pavel's death was ruled an accident, a tragic mishap during what appeared to be innocent exploration of the wilderness. Dmitry, as the only witness, provided a detailed account of how Pavel had fallen through thin ice, despite Dmitry's warnings. The adults were impressed by Dmitry's survival skills and his mature handling of such a traumatic situation. But the experience had revealed something profound to Dmitry. He had discovered that human suffering followed predictable geographical patterns, that pain could be mapped and measured like any other natural phenomenon. He began developing theories about what he called somatic geography, the idea that the human body was a landscape that could be explored and charted through the systematic application of stress. Dmitry excelled in his geographical studies, earning degrees from prestigious Soviet universities and establishing himself as a brilliant researcher specializing in extreme environment mapping. His professors praised his innovative approaches to terrain analysis and his intuitive understanding of how natural forces shaped landscapes. They had no idea that his insights came from his secret experiments in mapping human suffering. By the early 1980s, Dmitri had secured funding for a long-term research project in northern Alaska, ostensibly studying the effects of climate change on permafrost stability. The remote location was perfect for his true purposes, isolated enough to avoid scrutiny, but accessible enough to attract the subjects his research required. Dmitri's first victim in Alaska was Sarah Chen, a graduate student in environmental science who had joined his research team to study Arctic ecosystems. Sarah was intelligent, dedicated, and completely trusting of her distinguished supervisor. Dmitri spent weeks studying her psychological and physical characteristics, preparing for what he called comprehensive geographical analysis. Dmitri's approach was methodical and scientific. He had constructed a sophisticated laboratory beneath his research station, a complex of chambers designed to test human responses to various forms of environmental stress. The facility was equipped with monitoring equipment that could track vital signs, brain activity, and physiological responses with unprecedented precision. The murder took place in what Dmitri called his mapping chamber, a room designed to allow complete observation and documentation of human suffering. Sarah believed she was participating in a routine medical examination required for Arctic research, never suspecting that she was about to become the subject of Dmitri's most intimate geographical study. "Sarah, you're going to help me create the most detailed map of human experience ever conceived," Dmitri explained as he administered a paralytic agent that would render her conscious but unable to move. "I'm going to chart the exact pathways that pain follows through your body and mind, creating a geographical atlas of human suffering." Dmitri's technique involved applying various forms of stress while monitoring Sarah's responses with scientific precision. He used temperature extremes, pressure changes, chemical irritants, and psychological manipulation, documenting how each stimulus affected different regions of her body and mind. He was particularly interested in what he called pain migration patterns, the way suffering moved from one area to another as the body attempted to adapt to stress. Dmitri created detailed charts showing how agony flowed through Sarah's nervous system, mapping the geographical progression of her ordeal with the same precision he used to chart Arctic terrain. Subject exhibits initial stress responses in the extremities, Dmitri would note clinically. Pain migration follows predictable pathways toward the core. Psychological distress manifests in measurable physiological changes, documenting the complete geographical progression of human suffering. Sarah's death took over 18 hours, during which Dmitri gathered unprecedented data about the geography of human pain. He documented the exact pathways that suffering followed through her body, the timing of different stress responses, and the psychological progression from fear to despair to resignation. When Sarah finally died, Dmitri felt he had completed the most comprehensive mapping of human suffering ever conducted. He had charted territories of pain that no researcher had ever explored, creating geographical documentation of experiences that existed beyond the reach of normal scientific study. Sarah's death was attributed to exposure, a tragic accident that occurred during routine field research. Dmitri, as her supervisor, was praised for his attempts to save her life and his professional handling of the crisis. The scientific community mourned the loss of a promising young researcher, but Sarah was just the beginning. Dmitri had proven that human suffering could be mapped with geographical precision, and he began systematically expanding his atlas of pain. He developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for documenting the landscape of human agony, creating maps that showed how different types of stress affected various regions of the body and mind. Dmitri's victims were carefully selected from among the researchers, support staff, and visitors who came to his remote station. Each subject provided different geographical data. Some were chosen for their physical characteristics, others for their psychological profiles, all of them contributing unique information to Dmitri's comprehensive atlas of human suffering. Michael Torres was a bush pilot who regularly delivered supplies to Dmitri's station. He was physically robust, mentally tough, and experienced in surviving extreme conditions. Dmitri was particularly interested in how Michael's survival training might affect the geographical patterns of his suffering. Dmitri's approach with Michael was more complex than his previous experiments. He wanted to map not just the progression of pain, but the way survival instincts affected the geographical distribution of stress responses. He was studying how the human body reorganized itself under extreme duress, how pain pathways adapted to life-threatening situations. The murder took place during what Michael believed was an emergency medical situation. Dmitri had convinced him that a member of the research team was suffering from severe hypothermia and needed immediate evacuation. Instead, Michael found himself trapped in Dmitri's laboratory, subject to experiments designed to map the geography of survival stress. Dmitri's technique with Michael involved creating scenarios that triggered survival responses while documenting the physiological changes that occurred. He was mapping how the body's emergency systems affected the distributions of pain and stress, charting the geographical reorganization that occurred during life-threatening situations. Subject demonstrates enhanced stress tolerance consistent with survival training, Dmitri observed during the experiment. Pain distribution patterns show adaptation to extreme conditions, documenting the geographical effects of survival psychology on human suffering. Michael's ordeal lasted for days, during which Dmitri subjected him to every form of stress his laboratory could generate. He was creating what he considered the definitive map of survival suffering, documenting how the human body and mind adapted to extreme geographical conditions. When Michael finally died, Dmitri had gathered data that revealed new territories in his atlas of human pain. He had mapped the geographical effects of survival stress, charting how the body's emergency systems affected the distribution and intensity of suffering. Michael's disappearance was attributed to a crash in the wilderness, a common hazard for bush pilots operating in extreme conditions. Search teams found wreckage that Dmitri had carefully planted, confirming the official explanation for Michael's death. But Dmitri's research was expanding beyond individual mapping projects. He began planning what he called comparative geographical analysis, experiments that would allow him to compare the pain landscapes of different types of subjects, creating comprehensive atlases that showed how various factors affected the geography of human suffering. One of his most elaborate projects involved the Brennan family, environmental activists who had come to Alaska to document the effects of climate change. Dmitri was fascinated by their emotional bonds, believing that family relationships might create unique geographical patterns in the distribution of psychological stress. Dimitri's approach with the Brennan family was his most sophisticated undertaking. He wanted to map not just individual suffering, but the geographical interactions between related subjects, the way pain in one family member affected the stress patterns of others. The murders took place during what the family believed was a guided tour of Dimitri's research facilities. He had convinced them that his work on permafrost stability was directly relevant to their environmental concerns, never revealing that they were about to become subjects in his most comprehensive geographical study. Dimitri's technique involved subjecting all 4 family members to stress simultaneously while monitoring the geographical patterns of their responses. He was mapping what he called sympathetic pain geography, the way suffering in one subject affected the stress distribution in related individuals. The experiment lasted for weeks, during which Dimitri documented unprecedented data about the geographical nature of family suffering. He mapped how emotional bonds affected pain distribution, how psychological stress moved between related subjects, how the geography of agony was influenced by love and loyalty. When the Brennan family finally died, Dimitri felt he had completed the most comprehensive atlas of human suffering ever created. He had mapped territories of pain that existed beyond individual experience, charting the geographical landscape of shared agony. The family's disappearance triggered a massive search effort, but their bodies were never found. Dimitri had disposed of them in the permafrost, where they would remain frozen and hidden for centuries. The official investigation concluded that they had been victims of the harsh Arctic environment. But Dimitri's crimes were eventually discovered when a routine inspection of his research station revealed the underground laboratory and his extensive documentation of human suffering. The sophisticated equipment, the detailed maps, and Dimitri's comprehensive atlas of pain revealed the full scope of his activities. When authorities arrested Dimitri, they found him surrounded by thousands of pages of geographical charts, detailed maps of human suffering, and comprehensive atlases that documented the landscape of pain with unprecedented precision. He seemed proud of his work, eager to explain his discoveries to anyone who would listen. Dimitri showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting that his research had revealed fundamental truths about the geographical nature of human experience. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' characterization of his work as murder, maintaining that he had conducted legitimate geographical research using sound scientific methodology. "I have mapped territories that no explorer has ever charted," he told investigators. "My atlases document the complete geography of human suffering, revealing how pain moves through the body and mind like weather patterns across a landscape. These subjects didn't simply die. They helped me create the most comprehensive maps of human experience in history." During his trial, Dimitri attempted to present his crimes as legitimate geographical research, arguing that his atlases of human suffering represented a breakthrough in understanding the landscape of pain. He seemed unable to comprehend why his systematic torture and murder of 31 people was considered criminal rather than scientific. The jury was horrified by Dimitri's detailed documentation of his victims' suffering and his complete lack of empathy for their pain. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Dimitri continued his geographical research, creating maps of institutional suffering and documenting the landscape of incarceration. He maintained that his work would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking scientific achievement. Dmitry Volkov died in prison in 2011, still believing that his atlases of human suffering represented the most important geographical discoveries in human history. His research materials were destroyed by court order, but rumors persist that copies exist in private collections studied by researchers fascinated by his unique approach to mapping human experience. The case revealed the terrifying potential for scientific methodology to justify the most heinous crimes. Dmitry had used his expertise in geographical analysis to transform murder into what he considered legitimate cartographic research, turning his victims into unwilling contributors to his atlas of human suffering. Today, Dmitry's research station remains abandoned, its underground laboratory sealed, and its location classified by authorities. His story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to explore new territories, who use scientific precision to mask their darkest impulses. Dmitry Volkov proved that evil could wear the compass of exploration, that the pursuit of knowledge could be perverted into an instrument of systematic torture. He showed that the most sophisticated analytical skills could be used to justify the most primitive cruelty, transforming the mapping of terrain into the charting of human agony. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could chart the complete geography of human suffering. He was a cartographer who mapped not lands or seas, but the landscape of pain itself, creating atlases that documented territories of agony that existed in the darkest regions of human experience. In the rolling hills of rural Vermont, where maple trees turned crimson each autumn, and the only sounds were wind through leaves and the distant lowing of cattle, there lived a man who understood sound better than anyone else in the world. To the classical music community, Professor Julian Ashworth was a brilliant composer whose avant-garde works pushed the boundaries of musical expression. To his students at the prestigious Whitmore Conservatory, he was an inspiring teacher who could hear melodies in the most mundane sounds of daily life. But in the soundproof chambers he had constructed beneath his isolated farmhouse, Julian was composing something far more sinister than symphonies. Between 1985 and 1993, he murdered 26 people, each death carefully orchestrated to create what he called the Symphony of Final Silence, a musical composition that could only be completed by recording and analyzing the exact moment when human consciousness ceased to produce sound forever. Julian Ashworth was born in 1952 in London, the son of a renowned conductor and a concert pianist who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of musical perfection. His childhood was spent in concert halls and recording studios, surrounded by the greatest musicians of his generation, learning to hear subtleties in sound that escaped ordinary listeners. While other children played with toys, Julian studied the mathematical relationships between notes, the physics of sound waves, the precise mechanisms that transformed vibration into music. But Julian's relationship with sound went beyond normal musical training. He possessed what musicologists called perfect absolute pitch, the ability to identify any sound with supernatural accuracy. He could hear the emotional content in a person's breathing, could detect lies in the microscopic variations of vocal patterns, could sense psychological states through the subtle changes in how people moved through space. This gift manifested in disturbing ways during his adolescence. Julian became obsessed with what he called involuntary music, the sounds that people made unconsciously, the rhythms of their heartbeats, the melodies hidden in their breathing patterns, the percussion of their footsteps. He would record these sounds secretly, analyzing them like musical compositions, searching for patterns that revealed the hidden symphonies of human existence. At 17, Julian experienced what he would later describe as his musical epiphany. His younger sister, Catherine, was dying of leukemia, and Julian spent her final weeks sitting beside her hospital bed, listening to the gradual changes in her breathing, the weakening rhythm of her heartbeat, the subtle alterations in her voice as death approached. As Catherine's condition worsened, Julian became fascinated by what he called the music of mortality, the way dying created unique acoustic signatures that no living person could produce. He began recording her final days with sophisticated equipment, documenting the progression from life to death as if it were a musical performance. When Catherine finally died, Julian was convinced that he had witnessed something unprecedented in musical history. In her final moments, he claimed to have heard what he called the ultimate silence, a profound absence of sound that was more musical than any note ever played. He became obsessed with the idea that death created a form of music that could only be experienced once, at the exact moment when consciousness ceased to exist. This revelation shaped Julian's entire approach to composition. He began creating works that incorporated recordings of dying sounds, pieces that explored the relationship between life and silence, music that attempted to capture the acoustic signature of mortality. His compositions were praised by critics as groundbreaking explorations of sound and meaning, though none of them knew the true source of his inspiration. Julian's academic career flourished alongside his growing obsession with death music. He earned advanced degrees in composition and musicology, establishing himself as a leading expert in experimental sound theory. His professors were impressed by his innovative approaches to acoustic analysis and his intuitive understanding of how sound affected human consciousness. In 1984, Julian accepted a position at the Whitmore Conservatory, a prestigious music school nestled in the Vermont countryside. The isolated location was perfect for his purposes, far from prying eyes, but populated with the young, talented musicians his research required. Julian's first victim at Whitmore was Rebecca Martinez, a gifted violinist who had come to study under his guidance. Rebecca possessed what Julian considered perfect acoustic qualities: a pure, expressive voice, excellent breath control, and the kind of musical sensitivity that would produce exceptional death sounds. Julian spent months cultivating their relationship, positioning himself as a mentor who could help Rebecca achieve her musical dreams. He was genuinely interested in her talent, but he was more interested in her potential as a subject for his ultimate composition. The murder took place in Julian's private studio, a soundproof chamber he had constructed specifically for acoustic research. Rebecca believed she was participating in an experimental recording session that would showcase her abilities to important industry contacts. Julian's method was designed to preserve the natural acoustic qualities of death while allowing him to record every sound with perfect clarity. He used a combination of drugs that would cause gradual respiratory failure, allowing Rebecca to remain conscious and vocal throughout the dying process. "Rebecca, you're going to create the most beautiful music ever recorded," Julian explained as the paralytic agent took effect. "Your final sounds will become part of a composition that transcends ordinary musical expression. You'll achieve a form of artistic immortality that no living musician could ever reach. As Rebecca died, Julian worked frantically with his recording equipment, capturing every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle sound she made during the transition from life to death. He was particularly interested in what he called terminal vocalizations, the unique sounds that humans made only in their final moments. Rebecca's death took several hours, during which Julian gathered what he considered the most authentic musical material ever recorded. Her final sounds were unlike anything in conventional music, pure expressions of human consciousness at the moment of its extinction. Rebecca's death was attributed to a rare allergic reaction that had triggered respiratory failure. Julian, as her mentor, was devastated by the loss of such a promising young musician. He organized a memorial concert that was attended by the entire conservatory community, where he performed a piece he claimed was inspired by Rebecca's musical legacy. But in his private studio, Julian was incorporating Rebecca's death sounds into what he called his Mortality Symphony, a composition that could only be completed by recording the final moments of multiple subjects. He had discovered that death created musical possibilities that no living performer could achieve. Julian's selection criteria for subsequent victims were based on their acoustic potential. He sought musicians with specific vocal qualities, particular breathing patterns, unique tonal characteristics that would contribute different elements to his ultimate composition. David Chen was a young composer who had come to Whitmore to study experimental music theory. Julian was fascinated by David's intellectual approach to sound, believing that his analytical mind might produce unique acoustic phenomena during the dying process. Julian's approach with David was more elaborate than his first experiment. He spent weeks discussing musical theory with David, sharing his ideas about the relationship between consciousness and sound, gradually introducing concepts that would prepare David for what Julian considered the ultimate musical experience. The murder took place during what David believed was a collaborative composition session. Julian had convinced him that they were creating a revolutionary piece that would challenge conventional understanding of music and mortality. Julian's technique with David involved maintaining his consciousness throughout the dying process while recording his intellectual responses to approaching death. He was interested in how musical knowledge affected the sounds of dying, whether understanding composition would influence the acoustic qualities of mortality. David, you're about to experience music from a perspective that no living composer has ever achieved, Julian explained as he administered the lethal injection. Your final sounds will be informed by your understanding of musical theory, creating acoustic phenomena that bridge the gap between life and art. David's death provided Julian with what he considered revolutionary musical material. His final sounds were complex and intellectually informed, creating acoustic patterns that reflected his musical training and compositional knowledge. But Julian's research was expanding beyond individual recordings. He began planning what he called ensemble mortality, the simultaneous death of multiple musicians whose combined final sounds would create unprecedented musical complexity. One of his most ambitious projects involved the Whitmore String Quartet, 4 talented students who had formed a close musical partnership. Julian was fascinated by their musical chemistry, believing that their synchronized deaths would produce harmonic interactions that no conventional ensemble could achieve. Julian's approach with the quartet was his most sophisticated undertaking. He spent months studying their musical relationships, analyzing how they interacted acoustically, preparing for what he called the ultimate chamber music performance. The murders took place during what the quartet believed was a recording session for a major record label. Julian had convinced them that their performance would launch their professional careers, never revealing that they were about to become instruments in his macabre composition. Julian's technique involved coordinating their deaths while recording the acoustic interactions between their final sounds. He was creating what he considered the most complex musical composition in history, a piece that could only be performed once by musicians who were dying. The quartet's death provided Julian with unprecedented musical material. Their synchronized final sounds created harmonic relationships that existed nowhere else in musical literature, acoustic phenomena that could only occur at the intersection of life and death. But Julian's crimes were discovered when a maintenance worker found his underground recording studio and the sophisticated equipment he used to capture death sounds. The soundproof chambers, the recording devices, and Julian's extensive collection of mortality recordings revealed the full scope of his activities. When police arrested Julian, they found him surrounded by thousands of hours of death recordings, detailed musical analyses of final sounds, and compositions that incorporated the acoustic signatures of his victims' deaths. He seemed proud of his work, eager to share his musical discoveries with anyone who would listen. Julian showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting that his recordings represented the most important musical breakthrough in human history. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' horror at his methods, maintaining that his victims had achieved a form of artistic immortality through their participation in his ultimate composition. "I have recorded sounds that no living musician could ever produce," he told investigators. "My compositions incorporate acoustic phenomena that exist only at the moment of death, musical expressions that transcend ordinary human experience. These musicians didn't simply die, they created the most authentic music ever recorded." During his trial, Julian attempted to present his crimes as legitimate musical research, arguing that his death recordings represented a revolutionary new form of composition that challenged conventional boundaries between life and art. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic murder of 26 people was considered criminal rather than creative. The jury was horrified by Julian's collection of death recordings and his complete lack of empathy for his victims' suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Julian continued his musical research, analyzing the acoustic properties of institutional sounds and attempting to record what he called the music of incarceration. He maintained that his work would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking artistic achievement. Julian Ashworth died in prison in 2008, still believing that his death recordings represented the ultimate fusion of music and mortality. His collection was destroyed by court order, though rumors persist that copies exist in private archives studied by researchers fascinated by his unique approach to experimental composition. The case revealed the terrifying potential for artistic obsession to justify the most heinous crimes. Julian had used his musical expertise to transform murder into what he considered legitimate compositional research, turning his victims into unwilling performers in his macabre symphony. Today, the Whitmore Conservatory has implemented strict safety protocols and psychological screening for faculty members. But Julian's legacy lingers in the music community's awareness that artistic genius can mask the most destructive impulses. His story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of perfect art can become a justification for perfect evil. Julian Ashworth proved that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to create beauty, who use artistic vision to justify the systematic taking of human life. He showed that musical sophistication could mask the most primitive impulses, transforming the creation of sound into the orchestration of death. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could compose music that transcended the boundaries between life and death. He was a composer who sought to create the ultimate symphony, one that could only be performed by musicians at the exact moment their consciousness ceased to exist, their final sounds becoming notes in a composition that no living person could ever hear in its complete form. In the sleepy college town of Millfield, Massachusetts, where autumn leaves crunched underfoot and the smell of coffee drifted from cozy cafes, there lived a man who understood the human mind better than anyone else in the world. To his colleagues at the university's psychology department, Dr. Marcus Thorne was a brilliant researcher whose work on sleep disorders was revolutionizing the field. To his patients at the campus sleep clinic, he was a compassionate healer who could cure the most stubborn cases of insomnia and night terrors. But in the basement laboratory beneath his Victorian home, Marcus was conducting experiments that would have horrified even the most hardened investigators. Between 1987 and 1995, he murdered 33 people, each death occurring during what victims believed were therapeutic sleep studies. Marcus wasn't killing for money or pleasure. He was harvesting dreams, convinced that he could capture and preserve the final visions that played in dying minds, building what he called the archive of ultimate dreams. Marcus Thorne was born in 1954 in rural Oregon, the son of a psychiatrist father and a neurologist mother who had dedicated their careers to understanding the mysteries of human consciousness. His childhood was spent in medical conferences and research facilities, surrounded by discussions of brain function, neural pathways, and the elusive nature of human awareness. While other children played games, Marcus studied EEG readouts and learned to interpret the electrical patterns that revealed the hidden workings of the mind. But Marcus possessed an unusual gift that went beyond academic training. He was a natural, lucid dreamer, capable of maintaining consciousness while asleep, of controlling and directing his dream experiences with supernatural precision. More disturbing still, he claimed he could sometimes perceive the dreams of others, sensing the content of their sleeping minds through proximity and concentration. This ability manifested in troubling ways during his adolescence. Marcus would spend nights sitting beside sleeping family members, claiming he could read their dreams like books. He developed techniques for influencing others' sleep experiences, using subtle environmental manipulations to guide their subconscious minds toward specific types of dreams. At 16, Marcus conducted his first experiment in what he would later call dream archaeology. He had befriended a classmate named Jenny Walsh, a girl who suffered from chronic nightmares that left her exhausted and terrified. Marcus offered to help her overcome her sleep disorders, using experimental techniques he claimed to have learned from his parents' research. The sessions took place in Marcus's bedroom, where he had installed sophisticated monitoring equipment, supposedly borrowed from his mother's laboratory. Marcus would guide Jenny into deep sleep states while recording her brain activity, claiming he was mapping her nightmare patterns to develop targeted treatments. But Marcus wasn't trying to cure Jenny's nightmares. He was studying them, learning to access and manipulate her dream content for his own purposes. He discovered that he could influence her sleeping mind, directing her dreams toward increasingly vivid and intense experiences that provided him with unprecedented insights into the landscape of human subconsciousness. The final session took place during what Jenny believed would be her breakthrough treatment. Marcus had convinced her that he had developed a technique that would eliminate her nightmares forever, replacing them with peaceful, healing dreams. Instead, Marcus administered a carefully calculated dose of experimental drugs that would maintain Jenny's dream state while slowly shutting down her vital functions. He was convinced that the approach of death would intensify her dream experiences, creating visions of unprecedented clarity and meaning. As Jenny died, Marcus monitored her brain activity with obsessive precision, recording what he believed were the most profound dreams ever experienced by a human mind. He was convinced that the proximity of death had unlocked regions of consciousness that were normally inaccessible, allowing Jenny to dream with a depth and intensity that no living person could achieve. Jenny's death was attributed to an undiagnosed heart condition that had caused sudden cardiac arrest during sleep. Marcus, as her friend and would-be healer, was devastated by the tragic loss of someone he had tried so hard to help. No one suspected that he had orchestrated her death as the first experiment in his quest to harvest the ultimate dreams. But Jenny's death had provided Marcus with data that confirmed his theories about consciousness and mortality. His recordings showed unprecedented patterns of brain activity during her final moments, electrical signatures that suggested dream experiences of extraordinary complexity and meaning. Marcus threw himself into studying sleep disorders and consciousness research, earning advanced degrees in psychology and neuroscience. His professors were impressed by his innovative approaches to dream analysis and his intuitive understanding of how the sleeping mind functioned. They had no idea that his insights came from his secret experiments in harvesting the dreams of dying subjects. By the mid-1980s, Marcus had established himself as a leading expert in sleep research, securing funding for a comprehensive study of dream patterns and sleep disorders. He opened a clinic at the university where students and community members could receive treatment for various sleep-related problems. Marcus's first victim at the clinic was David Morrison, a graduate student who had been suffering from severe insomnia that was affecting his academic performance. David was desperate for help, willing to try any experimental treatment that might restore his ability to sleep normally. Marcus's approach was methodical and scientific. He had constructed a sophisticated sleep laboratory in his home basement, equipped with monitoring devices that could track brain activity, vital signs, and what Marcus believed were the electromagnetic signatures of dream content. The murder took place during what David believed was an intensive sleep therapy session designed to reset his circadian rhythms. Marcus had convinced him that the treatment required complete isolation and continuous monitoring over several days. Marcus's technique involved using a combination of drugs that would induce profound sleep states while gradually shutting down David's respiratory system. He was convinced that the dying brain would produce dreams of unprecedented intensity and meaning, visions that revealed the deepest truths about human consciousness. David, you're going to experience dreams that no living person has ever achieved, Marcus explained as the sedatives took effect. Your mind is going to explore territories of consciousness that are normally beyond human reach. Your final dreams will reveal truths about the nature of existence that philosophers have debated for centuries. As David died, Marcus worked frantically with his monitoring equipment, recording brain patterns that he believed represented the most profound dream experiences in human history. He was particularly interested in what he called terminal visions, the unique dream content that emerged only in the final moments of consciousness. David's death took over 12 hours, during which Marcus gathered unprecedented data about the relationship between dying and dreaming. His recordings showed complex patterns of brain activity that seemed to suggest dream experiences of extraordinary depth and complexity. David's death was attributed to complications from his sleep disorder, a tragic case of sudden death syndrome that occasionally affected young adults with severe insomnia. Marcus, as his treating physician, was praised for his dedication to helping such a difficult case. But in his basement laboratory, Marcus was analyzing David's final dreams with obsessive intensity. He had recorded what he believed were visions of ultimate truth, dream experiences that revealed the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality. Marcus began expanding his research, seeking subjects whose dreams would provide different types of data for his growing archive. He targeted people with specific psychological profiles, particular types of sleep disorders, unique neurological characteristics that might produce exceptional dream content. Sarah Chen was a young artist who had been experiencing vivid, prophetic dreams that seemed to predict future events. Marcus was fascinated by her apparent psychic abilities, believing that her death dreams might reveal the mechanisms behind precognitive experiences. Marcus's approach with Sarah was more elaborate than his previous experiments. He spent weeks studying her dream patterns, learning about her psychic experiences, preparing for what he called prophetic dream harvesting. The murder took place during what Sarah believed was a comprehensive study of her psychic abilities. Marcus had convinced her that his research could help her understand and control her prophetic dreams, possibly leading to breakthrough discoveries about the nature of precognition. Marcus's technique with Sarah involved maintaining her dream state for extended periods while monitoring her brain activity for signs of prophetic content. He was convinced that her dying dreams would contain visions of the future that could revolutionize human understanding of time and consciousness. Sarah, your final dreams are going to reveal the secrets of prophecy itself, Marcus told her as she slipped into the terminal sleep state. You're going to see beyond the boundaries of normal time, experiencing visions that show the true nature of past, present, and future. Sarah's death provided Marcus with what he considered revolutionary dream content. Her final brain patterns suggested experiences that transcended normal temporal boundaries, visions that seemed to encompass multiple timelines and possibilities. But Marcus's research was expanding beyond individual dream harvesting. He began planning what he called collective dreaming experiments, the simultaneous death of multiple subjects whose combined dream experiences would create unprecedented insights into the nature of shared consciousness. One of his most ambitious projects involved the Brennan family, who had come to his clinic seeking treatment for a rare genetic sleep disorder that affected all four family members. Marcus was fascinated by their shared condition, believing that their synchronized deaths would produce interconnected dreams that revealed the mechanisms of collective consciousness. Marcus's approach with the Brennan family was his most sophisticated undertaking. He wanted to harvest not just individual dreams, but the interactions between related minds during the dying process, the way family bonds affected dream content and consciousness transition. The murders took place during what the family believed was a revolutionary new treatment that would cure their genetic sleep disorder. Marcus had convinced them that his experimental therapy could eliminate their condition permanently, allowing them to experience normal sleep for the first time in their lives. Marcus's technique involved coordinating their deaths while monitoring the interactions between their dream states. He was convinced that their family bonds would create shared dream experiences that revealed new aspects of human consciousness. The experiment lasted for days, during which Marcus documented what he believed were unprecedented discoveries about the nature of collective dreaming. His recordings showed synchronized brain patterns that suggested shared dream experiences, visions that seemed to transcend individual consciousness. When the Brennan family finally died, Marcus felt he had achieved something revolutionary in consciousness research. He had recorded what he believed were the first documented cases of shared death dreams, experiences that proved the existence of collective human consciousness. But Marcus's crimes were discovered when a colleague became suspicious about the unusually high mortality rate among his research subjects. An investigation revealed his basement laboratory, the sophisticated monitoring equipment, and his extensive archive of death dreams. When police arrested Marcus, they found him surrounded by thousands of hours of brain activity recordings, detailed analyses of dream content, and theories about the relationship between consciousness and mortality. He seemed proud of his research, eager to explain his discoveries about the nature of human dreaming. Marcus showed no remorse for his crimes, insisting that his dream archive represented the most important breakthrough in consciousness research in human history. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' characterization of his work as murder, maintaining that his victims had achieved a form of transcendence through their participation in his ultimate dream experiments. "I have recorded the final dreams of 33 human beings," he told investigators. "These recordings contain visions of ultimate truth, experiences that reveal the deepest mysteries of consciousness and reality. My subjects didn't simply die, they achieved the most profound dream states ever documented, contributing to humanity's understanding of the true nature of existence." During his trial, Marcus attempted to present his crimes as legitimate consciousness research, arguing that his dream archive represented a breakthrough that would revolutionize psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic murder of 33 people was considered criminal rather than scientific. The jury was horrified by Marcus's detailed documentation of his victims' deaths and his complete lack of empathy for their suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Marcus continued his dream research, studying the sleep patterns of fellow inmates and attempting to record what he called the dreams of the incarcerated. He maintained that his work would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking scientific achievement. Marcus Thorne died in prison in 2012, still believing that his dream archive contained revelations about human consciousness that the world wasn't ready to understand. His recordings were destroyed by court order, though rumors persist that copies exist in private collections studied by researchers fascinated by his unique insights into the relationship between dreaming and dying. The case revealed the terrifying potential for scientific curiosity to become justification for the most heinous crimes. Marcus had used his expertise in sleep research to transform murder into what he considered legitimate consciousness exploration, turning his victims into unwilling subjects in his quest to understand the ultimate nature of human dreaming. Today, the University Sleep Clinic, where Marcus conducted his legitimate research, has implemented strict ethical oversight and safety protocols. But his legacy lingers in the scientific community's awareness that the pursuit of knowledge about consciousness can be perverted into instruments of death. Marcus Thorne proved that evil could wear the white coat of scientific inquiry, that the study of dreams could become a nightmare of systematic murder. He showed that the most sophisticated understanding of human consciousness could be used to justify the most primitive impulses, transforming the healing of sleep disorders into the orchestration of death. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could capture and preserve the most profound experiences of human consciousness. He was a weaver who sought to create the ultimate tapestry of dreams, one that could only be completed by harvesting the final visions of dying minds, preserving their last thoughts and images in an archive that no living person could ever fully comprehend. In the windswept moors of northern Scotland, where ancient stone circles stood sentinel against gray skies, and the only sounds were wind through heather and the distant cry of ravens, there lived a man who worked with materials no artist had ever touched. To the art world, Alasdair MacLeod was a visionary sculptor whose abstract works commanded astronomical prices at galleries in London and New York. To the locals in the remote Highland village of Cairnmore, he was an eccentric recluse who had inherited the old MacLeod estate and rarely ventured beyond its crumbling walls. But in the converted chapel on his ancestral grounds, Alasdair was creating sculptures from the most precious medium imaginable, human consciousness itself. Between 1986 and 1994, he murdered 28 people, each death carefully orchestrated to capture what he believed was the moment when the soul separated from the body, preserving that essence in sculptures that he claimed contained actual fragments of human consciousness. Alasdair MacLeod was born in 1953 in Edinburgh, the last heir to a Highland clan that had once ruled vast territories in the Scottish Highlands. His family had fallen from nobility to near poverty over the centuries, but they had retained their ancestral estate and their obsession with what they called the old ways, ancient Celtic beliefs about the nature of the soul and its relationship to the physical world. Alasdair's childhood was spent among the standing stones and burial cairns that dotted the MacLeod lands, listening to his grandmother's stories about the ancient druids who had once practiced their mysteries in these sacred places. While other children played with modern toys, Alasdair studied the carved symbols on prehistoric monuments, learning to read the stone language that his ancestors had used to communicate with the spirit world. But Alasdair possessed a gift that went beyond mere historical interest. He claimed he could sense the presence of souls in physical objects, that certain stones and metals retained traces of the consciousness that had once touched them. His family, steeped in Highland mysticism, encouraged this ability, believing it was a sign that Alastair had inherited the ancient powers of their druidic ancestors. At 14, Alastair experienced what he would later describe as his spiritual awakening. His grandfather, the previous laird of the estate, was dying of cancer, and Alastair spent his final weeks sitting beside the old man's bed, studying what he claimed were the visible emanations of his departing soul. As his grandfather's condition worsened, Alastair became convinced that he could see the soul beginning to separate from the physical body, manifesting as a luminous energy that became more visible as death approached. He began sketching these observations, creating detailed drawings that showed what he believed were the actual mechanics of soul departure. When his grandfather finally died, Alastair was certain that he had witnessed the moment of soul separation with unprecedented clarity. He claimed that the old man's consciousness had briefly lingered in the room before departing, leaving traces of its presence that Alastair could still detect days later. This experience shaped Alastair's entire worldview. He became obsessed with the idea that consciousness was a physical substance that could be captured and preserved, that the soul left measurable traces in the material world that could be harvested by someone with the proper knowledge and sensitivity. Alastair threw himself into studying both ancient Celtic mysticism and modern physics, searching for scientific validation of his beliefs about consciousness and matter. He learned about quantum mechanics, electromagnetic fields, and the theoretical possibility that consciousness might have measurable physical properties. By his early 20s, Alastair had developed sophisticated theories about what he called consciousness crystallization, the idea that human awareness could be captured and preserved in physical materials through proper techniques. He began experimenting with different substances, testing their ability to retain what he believed were the electromagnetic signatures of consciousness. Alastair's first murder was carefully planned and executed according to ancient Celtic rituals that he had reconstructed from archaeological evidence. In 1986, he selected Moira Campbell, an elderly woman from the village who had been suffering from a terminal illness and had expressed a desire to die peacefully on the ancestral lands of her clan. Alastair approached Moira as a fellow Highlander who understood the old traditions, offering to help her achieve what he called a sacred passing that would honor her Celtic heritage. Moira was grateful for his kindness, never suspecting that Alastair was planning to use her death as the first experiment in his quest to capture human consciousness. The murder took place in the converted chapel on Alastair's estate, a space he had transformed into what he called his soul forge, a workshop where he believed he could capture and preserve departing consciousness. The room was filled with ancient symbols, electromagnetic equipment, and specially prepared materials that Alastair claimed could absorb and retain spiritual energy. Alastair's method was based on his belief that consciousness departed the body gradually, allowing time for capture if the proper techniques were employed. He used a combination of traditional Highland herbs and modern pharmaceuticals to induce a peaceful death while maintaining what he believed were optimal conditions for soul harvesting. Moira, you're going to achieve something that no Highland warrior ever could, Alastair explained as the drugs took effect. Your consciousness will be preserved forever in stone and metal, becoming part of a sculpture that contains your actual soul. You'll achieve true immortality through art. As Moira died, Alastair worked frantically with his collection of specially prepared materials, stones from sacred sites, metals charged with electromagnetic energy, crystals that he believed could store consciousness like batteries. He was convinced that her departing soul was being absorbed into these substances, creating the raw materials for his first consciousness sculpture. Moira's death took several hours, during which Alastair gathered what he believed were unprecedented amounts of crystallized consciousness. When she finally expired, he immediately began working with the materials that had been exposed to her soul departure, shaping them into a sculpture that he claimed contained fragments of her actual awareness. Moira's death was attributed to natural causes, the expected end of her terminal illness. Alastair, as her friend and spiritual guide, was praised for helping her achieve a peaceful death in accordance with Highland traditions. The village held a traditional Celtic funeral that Alastair organized, where he spoke movingly about Moira's connection to the ancient ways. But in his chapel workshop, Alastair was studying the sculpture he had created from materials exposed to Moira's soul departure. He was convinced that the piece contained actual fragments of her consciousness that he had successfully captured and preserved human awareness in physical form. Alastair began refining his techniques and expanding his research. He developed increasingly sophisticated methods for what he believed was consciousness capture, using combinations of ancient Celtic rituals and modern electromagnetic technology to create optimal conditions for soul harvesting. His next victim was James Mackenzie, a young artist from Glasgow who had come to the Highlands seeking inspiration for his work. Alastair was fascinated by James's creative consciousness, believing that an artist's soul would produce particularly valuable material for his sculptures. Alastair's approach with James was more elaborate than his first experiment. He spent weeks cultivating their relationship, positioning himself as a fellow artist who understood the spiritual dimensions of creative work. He shared his theories about consciousness and matter, gradually introducing James to concepts that would prepare him for what Alastair considered the ultimate artistic collaboration. The murder took place during what James believed was a joint art project that would combine traditional Highland craftsmanship with contemporary artistic vision. Alastair had convinced him that they were creating a revolutionary new form of sculpture that would bridge ancient and modern artistic traditions. Alastair's technique with James involved maintaining his consciousness throughout the dyeing process while exposing specially prepared materials to what Alastair believed were the electromagnetic emanations of his departing soul. He was convinced that an artist's consciousness would produce unique spiritual signatures that would enhance the quality of his sculptures. James, you're going to become part of the greatest artwork ever created, Alastair explained as he administered the lethal drugs. Your consciousness will be preserved in stone and metal, creating a sculpture that contains your actual creative spirit. Your soul will inspire artists for centuries to come. James's death provided Alastair with what he considered revolutionary artistic materials. The substances exposed to his soul departure seemed to possess unique properties that Alastair interpreted as evidence of successful consciousness capture. But Alastair's research was expanding beyond individual soul harvesting. He began planning what he called collective consciousness sculptures, artworks created from materials exposed to multiple soul departures, pieces that would contain the combined awareness of several subjects. One of his most ambitious projects involved the Henderson family, tourists from England who had come to Scotland to research their Highland ancestry. Alastair was fascinated by their family bonds, believing that their simultaneous deaths would produce interconnected consciousness that could be captured in a single, complex sculpture. Alastair's approach with the Henderson family was his most sophisticated undertaking. He wanted to create not just individual consciousness sculptures, but a piece that contained the collective awareness of an entire family, their shared memories and emotional bonds preserved in physical form. The murders took place during what the family believed was a traditional Highland ceremony that would connect them to their ancestral heritage. Alastair had convinced them that participating in ancient Celtic rituals would help them understand their Highland roots and honor their clan traditions. Alastair's technique involved coordinating their deaths while exposing his materials to what he believed were the electromagnetic interactions between their departing souls. He was convinced that family consciousness would create unique spiritual resonances that would produce his most powerful sculpture yet. The experiment lasted for hours, during which Alastair documented what he believed were unprecedented phenomena in consciousness crystallization. His materials seemed to respond to the family's collective soul departure in ways that suggested successful capture of their combined awareness. When the Henderson family finally died, Alastair felt he had achieved something revolutionary in both art and spirituality. He had created what he believed was the first sculpture to contain multiple human consciousnesses, a piece that preserved an entire family's awareness in physical form. The family's disappearance triggered a massive search effort, but their bodies were never found. Alastair had disposed of them in the ancient burial cairns on his estate, where they would rest among the bones of his Celtic ancestors. The official investigation concluded that they had been victims of the harsh Highland weather. But Alastair's crimes were eventually discovered when an art dealer became suspicious about the unusual properties of his sculptures. Several collectors had reported strange experiences with Alastair's work, pieces that seemed to emanate warmth, sculptures that appeared to move in peripheral vision, artworks that produced inexplicable emotional responses in viewers. When authorities searched Alastair's estate, they found his chapel workshop with its sophisticated equipment for what he called consciousness capture, along with detailed documentation of his beliefs about soul harvesting and consciousness crystallization. Alastair showed no remorse when confronted with the evidence of his crimes. He seemed proud of his sculptures, insisting that they represented the greatest breakthrough in both art and spirituality in human history. He offered to demonstrate his consciousness capture techniques, believing that his work would revolutionize human understanding of the soul. "I have created sculptures that contain actual human consciousness," he told investigators. "These pieces don't just represent the human spirit, they preserve it, allowing souls to achieve true immortality through art. My subjects didn't simply die, they became part of something eternal and beautiful." During his trial, Alastair attempted to present his crimes as legitimate spiritual research, arguing that his consciousness sculptures represented a fusion of ancient Celtic wisdom and modern artistic innovation. He seemed unable to understand why his systematic murder of 28 people was considered criminal rather than sacred. The jury was horrified by Alastair's detailed documentation of his soul harvesting techniques and his complete lack of empathy for his victims' suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Alastair continued to believe that his sculptures contained actual human consciousness. He spent his time writing detailed treatises on consciousness crystallization and the spiritual properties of matter, convinced that his work would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking achievement. Alistair MacLeod died in prison in 2009, still believing that his consciousness sculptures represented the ultimate fusion of art and spirituality. His artworks were confiscated and destroyed by court order, though rumors persist that some pieces remain in private collections, studied by researchers fascinated by their unusual properties. The case revealed the terrifying potential for spiritual beliefs to justify the most heinous crimes. Alastair had used his knowledge of Celtic mysticism and artistic technique to transform murder into what he considered sacred ritual, turning his victims into unwilling contributors to his quest for spiritual immortality. Today, the MacLeod estate remains abandoned, its chapel workshop sealed, and its history largely forgotten by the Highland community. Alastair's story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to preserve the human spirit while systematically destroying human life. Alastair MacLeod proved that evil could wear the robes of ancient wisdom, that the pursuit of spiritual truth could be perverted into an instrument of systematic murder. He showed that the most sophisticated understanding of consciousness and soul could be used to justify the most primitive impulses, transforming the creation of art into the orchestration of death. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could capture and preserve the human soul in physical form. He was a sculptor who worked not with clay or stone, but with consciousness itself, creating artworks that he claimed contained the actual essence of human awareness, preserved forever in materials that had been exposed to the moment of soul departure.